The last topic for this week is the electrocardiogram, which is also called ECG or EKG. K is German, also stands for cardiac, and oftentimes EKG is more clear because ECG sounds more like EEG, which is electroencephalogram. So basically, unfortunately, both are used. ECG and EKG both refer to a view of the electrical activity of the heart. So you may have seen something like this. This is showing these traces here that correspond to electrical activity of the heart. And so I want to start with actually a couple really important things about the EKG before we dive into the components of it. One is that it's not a measure of individual action potentials. So it's not individual action potentials. These kind of look like depolarization, repolarization across a membrane, but it's not. This is electrical activity at the skin across the heart muscle. So it's a summation of electrical activities in the heart, not individual action potentials. Two, it's electrical activity, right? So that's all we're measuring here. These are going to correspond to contraction events, and we'll talk about those next week. But it directly is a measure of the electrical activity. And because of this, it's clinically relevant. So we can learn a lot about how the heart is functioning based on how these peaks and valleys look. So one more thing before I show you the components, I want to give you a sense of, going back to this, how we obtain this information. So this diagram here is showing you where you'd have different electrodes on the surface of the skin. And you will do this in lab. And the signal is reflecting the direction of the impulse relative to these electrodes. So this here is showing that depending on these three different electrodes, you would get different signals that look very different because it's all relative to where that electrode is when it's measuring. So we will look at one example. There's different types of EKGs you can do. They have electrodes in different places. We'll just do one so that you can learn that one. I do want you to be able to understand this basic idea here. Let me draw this out. So here I've got two different electrodes. One is negative and one is positive. So the electrodes themselves have a charge to them. You can see that on these here. And all the EKG is measuring is change in voltage towards positive or away from positive. So we're going to look at millivolts because that's how we measure electricity, even if it's not the same units as the action potential. If we're going towards a positive, this signal is going to go up. If we're going, so that's when we go this way. If there's a signal moving across the heart going this way, that signal is going to go down. So a negative to positive is going to be an upward deflection. And a positive to negative is a downward. And the point of telling you this is just so when we look at those components, you see those upward and downward reflections as movement across the skin and not measuring action potentials inside the neurons. So this may make more sense when we look at the components. So let's do that. Okay, components. Here, I'm not going to try to draw a time scale. We'll do that in a separate video. First, just the electrical events that are happening. So this is what an EKG looks like. It is millivolts on this axis here, and then time. And we're going to have these different bumps happen. Here's our P wave, got a little dip here. And then a big old wave here. So this is the electrical signals as measured across the heart on the skin. Let's label these. This is our P wave. This is going to be depolarization of the atria. Then we're going to have our Q, our R, and our S time points here. This is called the QRS complex. Big old peak that's ventricular depolarization. And again, this is not measuring depolarization of individual cells, but the movement of electricity across the heart. And then we've got our T wave. This is going to be repolarization of the ventricles. So it goes up like that, right? So this is not a going up, but upward deflection does not equal depolarization necessarily of anything. In this case, this represents the cells are repolarizing, but that signal is a positive deflection. Okay, let's look at this with a picture drawn by someone else. Here, this is a little bit more detail on these components. So you know this from the previous video, right? These, the intrinsic conduction system. So you know the signal starts in the SA node, and that is right here, and we're going to start an upward deflection as that signal starts to spread across the atria, and the P wave is then what you can see on the EKG when the atria depolarize. There's a delay, remember that, at the SAV node? So this is that delay right here. Cool, huh? Before the ventricles contract. Here, depolarize, and then are going to contract after that. So this is our ventricular excitation. So it fits, right, with what we know about the intrinsic conduction system. All it is visualizing that on a graph, that conduction system across the heart. It's not shown on this one, then that this would be repolarizing. The ventricles. The repolarizing of the atria is actually happens in here, but it's basically covered up by that QRS complex because that signal is so big. Okay, so the EKG is the map of the intrinsic conduction system. I've got a nice diagram. Some people like this. It goes a little too fast for me, but this is what's happening, right? This is showing you that map